Hello everyone, today's topic will be React Query, which is a special kind of library for synchronization of data in your application. So can we use it as a state manager in our React app? Let's find out. Here is the official website where you can find documentation and some useful information about the library. And you can also check out the GitHub page where you will find the source code and also some list of features. And for this specific project, I will be using JSON placeholder as a fake API and this specific user's endpoint. So let's get started. I created the project with create React app and I will run the project with the start command. So here is the basic template. And now I will install React Query with npm install command. And I have an error which says that our root project is using React version 18 and React Query is using 16.8 or 17. So I will need to downgrade the version in our project to 17. Now let's run npm install again. And it should be safe to install React Query. So we have React Query in our package.json and we are ready to go. So I will convert this function into the arrow function because that is the syntax that I like more. And I will remove this header because it is not going to be needed for this tutorial. And the logo as well. We should have a blank page in the browser, which is expected, and I will create a components folder. And I will create a component named user info, which should just display basic information about the users, such as name or address and stuff like that. So it will have just a basic template with the div element as a wrapper and the main heading inside. And I will export this component as a default module. And I can include it into the app.js. Let's check in the browser. Our beautiful component is here. So as I mentioned, I would like to display some basic information about the user in this component, and I will fetch this data from the server from the JSON placeholder API. So I will create a function to fetch data from the server, which will be called fetch user, and I will store the response into the variable and also add async and await keywords because we are going to use the fetch method, and I will provide the URL to the user's data, which will be this specific user with the ID of 1. So I will just paste this URL into the fetch method. And at this point we can get JSON from the response and maybe return it or store it in the local state of this component. So let's just return it. We fetched this data, but what to do next? If we have a component that should reuse some parts of the user's data, we might need to pass that data as a property or maybe store it in the global state manager and everything. So how React Query can be useful in this situation? I will create a new folder called hooks, and inside there I will create JS file which will be named useUsers. The plan is to put the whole logic about manipulating the user's data into this file. I will move fetch users to there. The next step will be to import React Query in the app.js component and wrap the root component with the query provider, and also to create a query client. So first I will import query client and then query client provider. These two modules will be responsible for creating a context that will be accessible by other components. And we will need to wrap the whole app with the query client provider and to create a query client instance, which we are going to pass to the query client provider as a property. If you check in the browser, nothing is going to be changed. So let's go back to the use users file. And here I will create a custom hook with the name use user query, which will use useQuery from React Query. And I will need to pass a query key, which will be the array of single string user, and a query function, which will be fetch user. And I will make this function exportable, so I can use it inside of the component. I will use it inside of the user info component, and the return value of this hook will be an object where we can access different type of states regarding users data. So you can access is loading or is error, and also the data itself. Let's see what we have for the data with the console log. I will just open the browser and check the terminal. So we have an object, and here we have some user data. So React Query provides us with a really nice way for checking the data status. Like in this example, we can check if the data is loaded or if there is any error loading the data. So we can just render the proper template in these specific cases. And the good thing that all the components that are using this query will be updated automatically, thanks to the query client provider which we used to wrap the whole application. Now we can remove console log and move data to the template. I will create a subheading element that will display the name of the user. So I will access the name property inside of the data object. And the username should be displayed on the page. Let's hide the browser's console. And another subheading element with the user address. Let's check the name of the fields. So the address is an object, so I will combine different fields from it, and I will wrap it with the template literals in order to display this in one string. So the street will be the first one, then I will display the suite. And the last one can be the city of this user. Now we displayed the full address of the user. So let's split this user info component into the separate components for each subheading. I will create the user name component, which will just return the h2 element. And I will also export this component. And now the question is how to access data. We can pass it through the property, of course, but imagine having a lot of nested components. It will be like a prop drilling. And the best way is, of course, to use the same use useQuery, which will make it sure that our data is consistent in different components. If you open the page, nothing is really changed, so we can do the same for the user address. I will create a separate component and render h2 element there as a template. I will copy and paste this template, and I will also import use user query. And make sure that you will export user address component. And let's go to the user info and replace the template with the user address. And if you check the page, still everything is the same. But if you open the browser's console and the network tab, you will see that there is one small thing which is not the same, and that is the number of requests to the server. So you will see that we have 2 requests to this endpoint. So this is a default behavior of React Query, and it happens because we have 2 components that use the same query. So every time the component is mounted, the query request will be triggered. We can override that rule, so I will go to useQuery and pass some options. It will be an object with a property refetch on mount, and I will set it to false. So now if we go back, we will see that only one request is made, so the other components consume the cached data. We can say that the state of users is held in the React query, and it can be considered as a global state since all the components have access to it. Another default behavior of React Query, which you might want to change, is that every time the window is in focus, the query will be re-triggered again. We can also change that in the options object by providing refetch on window focus property and set it to false. Another similar property to these two will be refetch on reconnect. So when the user loses internet connection, once the connection is back, the fetch request will be re-triggered. Now if we toggle the screen size, the fetch request will be triggered only once. I will show you another example of why we should set refetch on mount to false. I will create a state that will be responsible for displaying user's address. So by default it will be false. That means that the address is not going to be shown. And down below I will create a button, so when the user clicks on it, it will toggle between these two states. If the show user address is true, I will display hide address. Otherwise, I will display show address text. And I will also add the onClick event and call the set show user address method, and I will pass the opposite value of the current state. And I will render user address conditionally by checking the value of show user address. And I forgot to import React. I will do it right now. And now we can show and hide the address by clicking on the button. Now let's change the refetch on mount value, and you will see that every time the address is shown, the request is being made. So this is not what we want to have. So imagine that you have like a tooltip or like a drop down that will trigger a new request every time the component is opened or when the button is pressed. This doesn't mean that this feature is bad or wrong. You just need to know if you really need that, and maybe for some like component that uses highly dynamic or changeable data, it makes a perfect sense. Now the next thing that I want to do is to create a small form so the users can edit their names. The name of the component will be user name form, and it will return the form element and the textual input inside. And below that, I will add a button with the text submit and also with the type submit. I will export this component, and I can include it in the user info component. I will need to import this component, and the form should be visible on the page. So I would like to make the value of the input field equal to the text of the username. I will include use useQuery hook and access the user data. So I can now create a separate state. It will be username and set username as a method. And the default value will be username from the data object. Now we can set the value to be equal to the state of the username. So the reason why I created a separate state is because I don't want to allow mutations on the data object from useQuery. I can easily update the username with the onChange event. I will just call set username and provide the input value. I will also attach the onSubmit event listener and call handle onSubmit method, which I'm going to create. So it will be a function with the event as a parameter, and I will prevent default behavior because I want to control when the server will be contacted. I will create a function that I will call when the form is submitted, and the name of the function will be update username, and it will be asynchronous function, so I will add async keyword in front of it, and it will have a username as a parameter. So let's go to the JSON placeholder and search for the patch request method. So I will search for that endpoint, and you can search it in the guide. Here it is. I will copy and paste this whole fetch example. I will just replace this part of the URL with the users instead of posts. And also I will change the title inside the body. It should be name instead of the title. And I will pass the username for this property. So I will add await in front of the fetch method and store the response in the variable. And later I can return the JSON of the response, or maybe I can just console log it, but I will also need to add await keyword in front of that. I would like to call this update username when the form is submitted, and also to update the data that comes from the use user query. So with the React query, it doesn't make sense to have this method here because we cannot update the data from within the component. I will move update username into the use users. And I will change this function to return the JSON from the response. This function is not going to be used outside of this module, so I won't add export, but I will create a new custom hook which I'm going to use outside of this module, and it will be use update user. Maybe I can change the name of the function to be use update username in order to be more precise. So I will need to access the query client, and I will use useQuery client. And I want to return useMutation, which is like a special function from the React query, which will allow us to mutate the data inside of the query client. So I will also append the mutation to the name of the hook. Pay attention that I imported useMutation from React query. So I will need to pass the mutation function and also the object of options. So you can check the documentation page in order to see what are the possible options, but I will use on success, which will be like a event listener, which will be triggered when we have a successful response from the server, or to be more precise, when we have like a resolved promise from the update username, which is a mutation function. The first argument of this function will be the value that is returned from the mutation function, which is in this case response from the server, but we can call it new user because the server is going to return the updated user's data. Now we're going to call set query data from the query client, and I will pass the query key, which is going to be the same as in the use query. And I will pass the new user object, which is going to update the data from the use user query. Now I will use this hook inside of the username form component. So I will store the result of the hook in the username mutation variable and call use update username mutation function, and I will need to import it from the use users. Now the username mutation will contain the mutate method, which I'm going to call when the form is submitted, and I will also need to pass the username as a parameter, so I will pass the username state. Let's test it out in the browser. So my browser console is opened, and I will write another surname to this user. And when I press submit button, the name will be updated. And we can check the request. So the payload will contain the name, and the response will have the new username with the new surname appended. I will clear the network requests in the tab and refresh the page again, just to show you that initially we will have a GET request, and when the form is submitted we will trigger another request, which is going to be the patch request. So we are not going to need another GET request in order to update the data that is displayed. In other words, our global user state is updated with the use mutation. Now I will show you the example of how you can update the user's data before getting the response from the server. This approach is called optimistic update. So I will use onMutate callback function, which will be triggered immediately after calling the mutate method. So first thing that I want to do is to cancel queries, which I'm going to do by using the method cancel queries, and I will need to provide the query key, and this is asynchronous function, so I will need to add async and await. And the reason for this method is that we want to prevent some refetches to overwrite our optimistic update. Now we can use set query data in order to update the user data. So I will need to pass the query key, which is going to be the user. And now I will pass the function that should return the new user's object. And the function will have access to the previous user's data. So I will just spread the previous data and append a new name of the user, which is going to be passed from the argument. You can also call it variables if you have a complex object of different properties. And if you go to the username form, this value will be passed when you call the mutate method. So let's see how this optimistic update works. I will refresh the page and submit the form, and you will see that the username is updated even before we got a response from the server. But we might encounter a situation when we have an error from the server and the data is not updated on the server side, so there will be some misleadings. In order to simulate that, I will enter the wrong endpoint, which doesn't exist, and when I update the username, I will have an error in the browser's network tab, but the UI will be updated with the new username. So yeah, you see what is the issue here. The solution for this problem will be to use onError event method. In case of an error, we can revert the user data to the previous data. So I will just get the previous user data by using the query client and the method get query data. And I will pass the query key, and I will return the object that will hold the previous user data, and this object will be a context that will be accessible to other event methods. Now I will include onError event method, and I will have three parameters. First one will be the error object, the second will be username, and the third one will be a context, and that will be the object that we returned inside of the onMutate method. So here I will revert the user data to the previous data. So we can just pass the context.prevUserData, or we can access that directly inside of the function's parameter. Let's go to the browser and see what happens if we enter a new name. So we will get the old name because we have an error in the network request. Congratulations, you reached the end of this video. If you like it, please support me by subscribing to my channel. Thank you.